Chapter 1. A Death at the Winter Salon. The Winter Salon of the Veriton Club was not known for excitement. It was known for standards, tucked discreetly behind Grosvenor Square. The members-only club catered to a particular brand of aristocratic monotony. Men and women of distinction who preferred their scandals whispered and their whisky unmixed. Which is why the death of Lord Charles Devlin during a poetry reading struck everyone not only as tragic, but profoundly uncouth. He had been seated in a leather wingback chair, listening politely to Lady Honora Bellamy's shrill recitation of Shelley, when he abruptly slumped forward, the glass of port slipping from his fingers and spilling into the Persian rug. At first, no one moved. It wasn't until the second stanza, something about the azure gloom of eternity, that someone noticed Devlin hadn't stirred. By the time Dr. Ransom arrived from the lounge and checked the body, it was clear there would be no revival. He was dead, no blood, no wound, no visible sign of distress, only the faint scent of almonds, which the doctor dismissed as perfume, perhaps. But one person in the room, an unassuming guest of the club, seated unobtrusively near the fireplace, raised a finely arched eyebrow, and said nothing. Not yet. 2 days later, Hercule Poirot sat in the same wingback chair Lord Devlin had occupied, his hands folded, eyes narrowed in contemplation. He had been invited to the club as a matter of delicacy. "You understand," said Colonel Wexley, the club's current chairman. "We can't have the police tramping through here again. The papers are already sniffing at the door." "And you are certain," Poirot asked softly, "that Lord Devlin's death was not natural?" Wexley cleared his throat. "Well, no, I'm not certain of anything. But the coroner's report said cardiac event, and yet he was only 60. No history. And then there's this." He placed an object delicately on the side table, a small, elegant silver ink pot, its surface tarnished slightly with age. Poirot leaned in. The lid was off. Inside, the ink had been diluted, thin, watery, reddish in hue, and beside it, faintly etched in the base, were the initials D.D. Poirot looked up. "This is not his?" Wexley shook his head. "No, Devlin never wrote with anything but a fountain pen. That inkpot belonged to Delphine Devereux, a writer, poet, one of our more flamboyant members. She loaned it to Lady Honora the night of the reading." "Curious," Poirot murmured. "And it was on the table beside Lord Devlin?" "Yes, along with a small stack of parchment and a quill. Decorative, really. But the odd part is that Lady Honora insisted she never touched the inkpot after Delphine handed it over. Claims it was just for ambiance." "Ambiance, eh?" Poirot gave a faint smile. "Ah, how poetic, and yet one cannot help but wonder, if no one used the ink, why is it changed?" Wexley exhaled. "I was hoping you'd ask that." Poirot stood, brushing a speck of lint from his sleeve. "Very well, I shall speak with those present. Quietly, discreetly. You say there were 6 in the room at the time?" Wexley nodded. "Yes. Besides Devlin and myself, there was Lady Honora, Delphine Devereux, Mr. Rupert Halliwell, and Miss Beatrice Lee." Poirot raised a brow. "Ah, and a blend of egos, I presume." "You could say that." Wexley's mouth twisted. "Devlin had money. Halliwell had ambition. Honora had resentment. Delphine had a reputation. And Beatrice, Well, she had secrets. Poirot smiled faintly, but of course, it would hardly be a proper mystery otherwise. Poirot began his investigation not with interviews, but with observation. He requested to be seated during the club's Thursday gathering, the same time of day, in the same salon, with the same arrangements as before. Lady Honora read again, though her voice faltered now with each stanza. Delphine smoked from a long black holder, watching Poirot through narrowed eyes. Halliwell, stiff in his double-breasted coat, barely looked up from the notes in his lap. Beatrice Lee lingered near the tea-cart, her gloved hands trembling just slightly as she poured. Poirot watched them all. He watched how they avoided the chair where Devlin had died, how no one approached the ink-pot, how Beatrice's eyes flitted nervously every time someone mentioned the word poison. When the reading ended, he stood slowly. "Merci, mesdames et messieurs," he said with a polite bow. "It is always a pleasure to hear verse recited with such passion." Lady Honora gave a tight smile. "But now," he continued, "I must ask to speak with each of you, separately." He turned to Wexley. "And before I begin, Colonel, might I impose upon the club for a pot of tea?" "Of course," Wexley replied. Poirot smiled. "Excellent, for it is with tea that many truths are steeped." Chapter 2. The Circle of Motives. Veriton Club had no official interrogation room. Such things were considered vulgar. But the reading lounge on the second floor offered Poirot precisely what he needed. Privacy, low lighting, and a single velvet armchair placed before a fire that crackled with soft defiance against London's spring chill. Poirot took his seat, tea at his side, and motioned for the first guest. Lady Honora Bellamy entered wearing a stiff-collared lavender coat and a hat tilted at a defiant angle. She sat without waiting for invitation. "Let's not make a drama of it, Monsieur Poirot," she said, voice clipped. "Lord Devlin and I were hardly intimate friends." "Ah, but, madame," Poirot replied, "sometimes it is not the depth of the friendship, but the sharpness of the resentment that reveals more." Honora's eyes narrowed. Poirot continued. "You read Shelley the evening of his death. You were seated only feet from him." She gave a haughty sniff. "Yes, and he died during the second stanza, not during my phrasing. I'm not so dreadful, a performer that I induce collapse." Poirot allowed a faint smile. "What was your relationship to Lord Devlin?" "We were contemporaries. He held influence. I required a sponsor to reintroduce my poetry collection this spring. Devlin promised to consider it. That was the last I heard." "And how did you feel about that?" "Irritated, of course. But I'm not a poisoner, nor a fool. If I wanted him dead, I wouldn't do it during my own reading." Poirot sipped his tea. "The ink-pot. You say you did not touch it?" "No. It was decorative. Delphine insisted on bringing it for atmosphere." "Then you did not open it? Dip a pen?" "I barely looked at it." Poirot made a note in his little leather-bound book. "Merci, madame. Is that all?" she asked, rising sharply. "For now," Poirot replied. She left without a glance back. Next was Rupert Halliwell, all sharp suits and smoother words. He entered with the calculated stride of a man who had practised it in front of a mirror. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, offering a handshake. Poirot declined with a polite incline of the head. A pleasure, under rather unfortunate circumstances. Indeed, monsieur. Please sit. Rupert folded himself into the chair, one ankle resting on a knee. I assume you're here to look beneath the polished surfaces. Poirot nodded. The club's carpets are well brushed, but I have found that the dust of motive clings to even the finest tweed. Rupert chuckled, but his fingers twitched slightly. You knew Lord Devlin well? We were rivals, Halliwell admitted, socially, financially, philosophically. Philosophically? He believed that art should be privately appreciated. I believe it should be owned. He collected manuscripts and kept them behind glass. I collect voices, influence. Poirot raised an eyebrow. And influence is not threatened by the death of such a man? Oh, it is, but perhaps his death also opens opportunities for new voices. Poirot jotted a note. And where were you seated during the reading? To the left of Devlin, a row behind. Did you notice anything unusual? Rupert leaned back. He looked pale, but then so do most men over 60. I thought he'd simply fallen asleep. The Shelley recital wasn't exactly lively, and the inkpot? Rupert gave a dismissive gesture. Pure nonsense. Set dressing. I wouldn't be caught dead using a quill. Far too theatrical. Poirot gave a polite nod. Merci, monsieur. That will be all. The third visitor was Delphine Devereux. She entered slowly, trailing scent and silk in her wake. A poet, a widow, and a woman far too intelligent to let her emotions surface. She sat like someone preparing for an interview she had conducted 100 times before. You wish to speak of Charles Devlin? She asked. I wish, Poirot said gently, to understand your role in his death. Her lips curled faintly. I had no role, monsieur. You lent Lady Honora your inkpot. I did, for effect. She loves such frills. The ink was water and red dye for show. You're certain of that? I filled it myself, and sealed it. Poirot steepled his fingers. And yet the coroner noted an almond scent, indicative perhaps of bitter compounds. Cyanide. Delphine's face did not change. I lent the inkpot. I did not prepare his drink, nor did I sit beside him. You do not seem distressed. Grief, she said, has never looked flattering on me. Besides, Charles was not a good man. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Go on. He held secrets over people like umbrellas, ready to open them at the slightest rain. I suspect he had something on each of us. And on you? She smiled thinly. You'll have to work for that, monsieur. Poirot inclined his head. Touché, madame. Last to arrive was Miss Beatrice Lee. She was young, nervous, and dressed simply in navy blue. She entered without flair, her steps almost silent. On the rug, Miss Lee, Poirot said kindly. Please do sit. She did, folding her hands tightly in her lap. You were nearest the drinks tray during the reading, Poirot said. Yes, I pour for the guests. And you poured for Lord Devlin? She swallowed. Yes, a port. He always took the same. Did anyone instruct you to add anything? No, she whispered. But you seem afraid, mademoiselle. She blinked. I don't know who to trust. Then trust me, Poirot said gently. What do you know that you have not told? Beatrice looked down. I saw Rupert place something in Lady Honora's handbag before the reading. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Something? a vial, small glass. Did you tell anyone? No, I thought it was personal. I didn't want to get involved. Poirot made a final note. Merci, mademoiselle. You have done the right thing. She nodded and left, her footsteps quicker now. When the last door closed, Poirot sat alone before the fire. He sipped the final dregs of his tea and reviewed his notes. The ink pot, the poisoned drink, the secret vial, and the question no one had asked, what did Devlin know that made him worth killing? Because someone had silenced him, and in doing so had written a message in invisible ink, one that Poirot would now begin to read. Chapter 3. A Secret Among Poets. The sun broke tentatively over Grosvenor Square the next morning, its pale light brushing the tops of the wrought-iron railings with a thin silver sheen. Poirot arrived early at the Veritan Club, not to question, but to observe. It was one of his core principles, return to the scene, not to see what others missed, but to re-see what had already been seen, with new information and newly awakened little grey cells. The winter salon was empty now, echoing slightly with the absence of conversation. The wing-back chair where Lord Devlin had died had been reupholstered already, as if the staff had hoped to erase the moment. But Poirot knew better. The ghosts, he muttered, prefer tidy places. He walked slowly to the reading table. The silver ink pot, now cleaned and resealed, had been returned by the club staff. He picked it up gently. The surface was cool, to the touch. Delphine had claimed it was decorative, but something still gnawed at Poirot's instinct. He sniffed the interior, faintly metallic, faintly sweet. Even if the ink-pot had not contained poison originally, someone had tampered with it after Delphine delivered it to Honora. He turned next to the drinks trolley, examining the glasses still stored underneath. None matched the one Lord Devlin had held. His had been taken away and washed by the time of his arrival. But Poirot noted the spacing between the glasses, 2 in front, 4 in back. Beatrice would have reached for one from the front row. He stooped slightly, peering underneath the trolley. There, wedged between the wheels and the base of the wood frame, was a tiny square of parchment. Carefully, he extracted it. It had clearly been torn from a larger page. The handwriting on it was flowing and expressive, like a poet's performance on the page. But it had been crossed out violently. The ink scored deep into the paper, and if I die among verse, no, it was not beauty that killed me, but fear. Poirot turned the fragment over. On the back, a signature. Deshiju, Delphine Devereux. Downstairs in the club's archive room, a quiet chamber of filing cabinets and scent of dry paper, Poirot was granted access to the club's literary correspondence by the reluctant archivist, Mr. Dallow. Officially, sir, these are for historical reference, he said, eyes darting to the brass lock Poirot had gently bypassed with a raised eyebrow. And the phrase, "Murder, monsieur," is history's rudest interruption. Within moments, Poirot located a thin folder marked Devereux D. It contained letters, some typed, some handwritten, all dated within the past 3 months. One in particular caught his eye. A letter addressed to Lord Charles Devlin, D. Dear Charles, I understand discretion is your currency, but I must insist, do not bring that matter up again in public. I've spent 2 years recovering my name, and a scandal now would undo everything. Let the past sleep. I have no more ink to waste on guilt. Signed again. Didi Poirot tapped the edge of the folder. A secret worth poisoning for? Perhaps, but perhaps still not enough. By midday, Poirot arranged another short audience, this time with Miss Beatrice Lee. She arrived nervously, as before, and took her seat across from him in the reading lounge. Miss Lee, Poirot said gently. You are fond of poetry, are you not? She nodded. Very. Then tell me, mademoiselle, what do you make of this? He handed her the torn parchment. She read it, blinking fast. It's Delphine's writing, her tone. But I've never seen this line. You are familiar with her unpublished work? Beatrice flushed. I've copied some of her early drafts. She lets me type them. I help organize her notebooks. Poirot's voice was mild. And what of this particular passage? I think it was from a poem she never finished. I saw it in her notebook weeks ago. But it wasn't meant to be read. She said it was a raw thought, a fear. Fear of what? Beatrice looked down. Devlin knew about her marriage. The first one. The scandal. The restraining order. She thought it was buried. Poirot tilted his head. You admire her? She's brilliant, Beatrice whispered. She doesn't deserve to be punished forever. Even if she were involved in Devlin's death? Beatrice looked up. I don't know. Poirot gave a small nod. Merci, mademoiselle. You may go. As she left, Poirot folded the parchment and slid it into his notebook. Delphine had feared exposure. Devlin had threatened it, but Delphine, for all her poetic grandeur, was not careless. Tintoret would not kill someone in the middle of a salon. Too gauche, too messy. But what if someone else, wanting to protect her or their own fragile position, had acted on her behalf? By early evening, Poirot sat across from Delphine Devereux in the upstairs lounge. The fire crackled again. A single glass of sherry stood untouched beside her. He slid the parchment onto the table. She stared at it. I destroyed that, she said softly. Not quite, Poirot replied. Her voice was slow, measured. I wrote that after a private meeting with Devlin. He suggested he might reveal the details of my first marriage to the press. Unless I convinced Lady Honora to abandon her funding for Beatrice's literary fund and endorse his instead. A literary blackmail. He wanted to take credit for launching 3 young male poets, all vapid, moneyed and dull. I refused, he threatened. And did you believe he would act? She looked away. With Devlin, one always believed the worst. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And did you ask someone to silence him? No, she said, but I was afraid someone might. He waited. She looked up. Beatrice. It was always the quiet ones. Poirot had seen it many times. Those who watched from the corners, who said little, who went unnoticed. They saw the most. And sometimes they acted when no one else would. Later that evening, Poirot requested one final conversation with Beatrice. He met her not in the club, but on the garden terrace, just beyond the conservatory. The air was cold, the sky steel grey. Miss Lee, he said. "You slipped the vial into Lady Honora's handbag." Beatrice paled. You believed she would use it to spike Devlin's drink. You hoped to deflect blame. But Honora never touched the glass. "You did." She said nothing. Poirot's voice was calm. "You mixed just enough into the ink pot, knowing Devlin would use it to sign a thank-you note before leaving. He did it every time. A charming gesture. Beatrice's hands trembled. He licked the nib before sealing the letter." Poirot continued. "And that was enough." Tears welled in her eyes. "He was going to destroy her. He laughed about it." Poirot placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "The intention may have been loyalty, but the outcome was murder." She collapsed onto the bench, sobbing. Poirot looked to the stars, faint behind London's haze, and whispered, "Ink, ambition, and death. All, it seems, right with the same hand." Chapter 4. The Psychological Game. Begins by the following morning. Poirot had changed his strategy. No longer sought facts. He sought fractures. And the only way to find them was by shifting the game, not through interrogation, but by invitation. Let them speak. And in speaking, watch who over-explains, who hesitates, who panics in the silence. At precisely 11 o'clock, Poirot requested all 4 remaining members of the salon to gather in the private lounge. Lady Honora Bellamy, Rupert, Halliwell, Delphine Devereux, and Colonel Wexley arrived within minutes, their expressions painted in varying degrees of confusion, irritation, and caution. "I trust you have not gathered us to accuse anyone in public," Lady Honora snapped before she was seated. Poirot raised a calming hand. "Mais non, madame. I have invited you to help me reconstruct the scene. Together, as a group of witnesses, not as suspects." Rupert Halliwell leaned forward. "Sounds theatrical, Poirot." "Indeed," Poirot replied. "Theatre, monsieur, often brings truth to the stage." He directed them to take the same seats they had occupied the night of the reading. With meticulous precision, he replicated the arrangement, the same lighting, the same drinks tray, the same ink pot placed exactly where it had been before. He stood at the fireplace, fingers lightly touching the mantel. "Let us begin with the moment of death. Lord Devlin, seated here," he motioned to the empty wingback, "was reading the programme when he suddenly slumped forward." Delphine's lips tightened. Poirot continued. "Now, Dr. Ransom attributed this to a cardiac event. But a cardiac event rarely smells of bitter almonds, n'est-ce pas?" Silence. Poirot turned to Honora. "Madame, you were mid-recital. Did you see his expression change?" "I didn't notice until someone gasped," she said coldly. "I was focused on my lines." "Of course, poetry demands commitment." He turned to Rupert. "Monsieur Halliwell, you said Lord Devlin seemed pale before the event?" "I did. He looked unwell. Distracted." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Distracted? By your presence?" Rupert blinked. "What do you mean?" "You slipped a vial into Lady Honora's handbag." Gasps filled the room. Rupert's face flushed dark crimson. "That's ridiculous. Beatrice Leigh saw you," Poirot said smoothly. "She thought it odd, but said nothing. Tell me, monsieur, what did you intend her to do with it?" And fumbled. "It was for a private matter. A medicinal blend. Honora has frequent headaches." "Ah, so you dose her without her knowledge?" Honora stood suddenly. "Is this true, Rupert?" "Of course not," he snapped. "This is all a twisting of circumstance." Poirot turned toward the group, his tone now colder. "The truth, mes amis, is that all of you had reason to want Lord Devlin silenced." He looked to Delphine. "You feared exposure. His threats to publish your past would have destroyed your career." To Honora, "You needed his endorsement to secure your place on the board of the National Poets Society. Without it, your influence would diminish." To Halliwell, "You envied him. You needed the patronage he monopolized, and you knew his death would open the door." And then Poirot stepped back, letting silence fall. He let it stretch, past the bounds of politeness, past the comfort of indifference. People speak to fill silence, but murderers react to it. Rupert was first. "This is absurd," he hissed. "You have no proof, no motive." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Motive? You shared a manuscript with him, one he rejected. You rewrote passages that resembled his own essays. Plagiarism by osmosis, monsieur." Rupert stood. "That's slander." Poirot gave a thin smile. "Not slander, monsieur." "Deduction." Delphine was next. "I didn't kill him, Poirot. But yes, I was afraid he'd ruin me. But murder?" She shook her head. "Not even I would go that far." Poirot nodded. "And yet your words are everywhere, madam, even in the note he sealed that night." Honora blinked. "He wrote a note?" Poirot held up a folded letter, retrieved from the club's lost property box. "He wrote it during your reading. It was found among the unclaimed correspondence, addressed to his solicitor." He opened it and read aloud. "The game is moving faster. Devereux plays at innocence. Halliwell masks ambition. Honora is louder than she knows. If anything happens to me, I suspect the one who speaks the least." CD. They were silent again. Poirot folded the letter. "And so we come to it. Devlin knew someone meant to harm him, and he narrowed it down not by action, but by silence." "Honora," whispered Beatrice. Poirot nodded. "Oui, Beatrice lay, quiet, watchful Beatrice, who believed she was protecting Delphine, who knew the ink-pot was tampered with, who placed it carefully beside Devlin, knowing his habits. He always sealed his letters with a lick of ink. It was his signature." Poirot stepped away from the firelight. She did not mean to be a murderer. She meant to be a shield. Rupert muttered, "The silent ones always surprise you." Poirot turned to him sharply. "No, monsieur. The silent ones do not surprise. We simply fail to hear them." That afternoon, Poirot sat alone in the empty winter salon, the silver ink-pot resting on the table beside him. Inspector Durant arrived, shortly thereafter, reading over Poirot's letter of confession, signed by Beatrice, tearfully and without resistance. She confessed fully, Durant said she acted on impulse. No intent to kill. Poirot nodded. "It is a tragedy," he murmured. "But so often the tragedy begins long before the crime." Durant tapped the ink-pot. "Strange weapon." Poirot stood slowly. "Not strange, my friend. Symbolic." He looked around the empty salon. "Weapons take many forms. But the deadliest?" He tapped his temple. "A thought, unspoken." Chapter 5. The Hidden Manuscript. 2 days after Beatrice Lee's quiet confession and subsequent arrest, the Veritan Club began returning to its curated normalcy. The ink-pot had been removed. Lord Devlin's name was quietly omitted from the club's spring announcements. His portrait, previously scheduled to be unveiled in the East Corridor, was shelved indefinitely. But Hercule Poirot, who was never quite satisfied by the obvious, remained behind. And his unease had grown, not diminished, since the confession. Beatrice's actions fit the shape of guilt, yes, but the texture of the truth, the emotional resonance, the subtle contradictions, did not sit comfortably in Poirot's mind. She had spoken with genuine remorse, but remorse, Poirot had often said, was not proof of guilt. Many people confessed to crimes they did not commit, for love, for pressure, or to protect someone more dangerous. And Poirot had begun to suspect that was the case here. It was Delphine, Devereux, who confirmed his doubts. She arrived at Poirot's guest apartment in Mayfair with no fanfare, dressed in black silk and the faintest trace of perfume. She did not sit until invited. "I've been going through Devlin's private correspondence," she said. "His solicitor sent me a few documents for review, since I was named in his estate's publishing rights." "Ah," Poirot said, eyes glinting. "And you have found something interesting, oui?" She nodded and produced a folded bundle of yellowed pages bound by a red ribbon. Devlin was working on a manuscript, a memoir, of sorts. Poirot took it gently. The title page was handwritten, "The Art of Leverage, Memoirs of a Collector of Secrets." He turned the pages slowly. Anecdotes, conversations, club politics. But near the middle, a section had been dog-eared. "But the greatest leverage is not in secrets, but in the suggestion of their existence. One must never reveal the scandal, only imply that one might. That is how you truly own a person." Poirot closed the manuscript. This was his philosophy. Delphine's voice was bitter. Yes, he wielded rumour like others wield titles. "Did you read further?" She hesitated. "There's something else. The last pages were missing. Torn out." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "And who else knew of this manuscript?" "Only a few. Myself, Wexley perhaps, and Rupert Halliwell." Poirot visited the Veriton archives again, asking once more for the club's guest logs, literary submissions, and any papers recently withdrawn. Mr. Dallow, the archivist, had his sleeves rolled and a faint ink stain on his fingers. "There was one unusual request," he said. "About 4 days ago, Halliwell came in asking about Devlin's personal file. Said he was curating a remembrance piece, but he never signed the withdrawal slip." "Meaning," Poirot said, "he took something unofficially." Dallow nodded. "I didn't think it mattered, but the file had 2 essays, correspondence, and a small notebook. Only the essays are left now." Poirot stood. "Merci, monsieur. That is very helpful." That evening, Poirot invited Rupert Halliwell to his flat for what he described as a private gesture of closure. Rupert arrived in a dove-grey coat and too much cologne. He looked confident until he saw the manuscript on the table. "Ah," Poirot said, noting the brief flicker of recognition. "You recognize it?" Rupert forced a smile. "Devlin's work. Yes, we all knew he liked to collect stories." "And did you contribute to those stories?" Rupert hesitated. "I may have. Once." Poirot stood, walking to the window. "Monsieur Halliwell," he said without turning, "Beatrice Lee confessed, and yet I do not believe she acted alone, or perhaps not at all. Rupert scoffed. Why? Because she's sweet and mousy? Because she lacked one key ingredient: access. Poirot turned slowly. You see, the inkpot was tampered with in a way requiring knowledge of chemistry. Precision. You, monsieur, were once a pharmacology student before pursuing literature, were you not? Rupert stiffened. Barely a year. Still long enough to know the dose of cyanide that might be absorbed through mucosa. Long enough to understand how Devlin's habits, licking the nib of his pen, might make him vulnerable. Poirot stepped closer. You encouraged Beatrice to confess, did you not? Played upon her fear. Suggested it was her mistake. You provided the vial. Planted it, not in Honora's bag, but where Beatrice would see it. Rupert's expression darkened. You have no proof. No, but I have logic. Devlin discovered your plagiarism, your reworking of his old critiques, submitted under your name. He threatened to expose you. And worse, to blacklist you from every reputable publisher in London. His word against mine. And now his word is silent. Rupert moved to the door. Poirot blocked it. You took the final pages of his manuscript, he said quietly. The ones that named you. Rupert turned. I did what was necessary. Poirot's tone dropped an octave. And Beatrice? She was collateral. She panicked. I gave her an explanation that made sense. She believed it. She was in love with Delphine. I know. There was a long pause. Poirot sighed. You are clever, monsieur, but cleverness without conscience. That is the most dangerous poison of all. Rupert Hallowell was arrested that night, not for murder, yet, but for tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice. The manuscript pages were found in a drawer in his apartment, wrapped in wax paper and labelled draft fragments. Poirot submitted his full findings to Scotland Yard. Beatrice Lee was released the following morning. She had not spoken a word during the process, just wept silently as Poirot offered her a handkerchief and a rare, sincere smile. It was never your crime, he said gently. She looked up, but it was almost my ruin. Poirot nodded. Words, mademoiselle, are weapons, but so too is silence. Next time, speak. Later, alone, Poirot returned to his armchair. The silver inkpot sat on the mantel. He tapped it once, gently. No sound, no ink, just gleaming metal, hollow and quiet. A curious object, he mused aloud. An instrument of elegance and death. He lifted it, turning it in his hand. Like a writer's soul, he added softly, and then he placed it back on the mantel where it could remain, visible, remembered, and empty. Chapter 6. The Final Gathering. The winter salon of the Veriton Club had been prepared once more. Poirot insisted on precise replication. The chairs arranged in a semicircle around the fireplace, the silver inkpot returned to its original table, and fresh firewood crackling in the grate. The club staff had protested, mildly scandalized by the symbolism, but Poirot was resolute. A scene once set, he explained, must be reperformed in order for the final act to unfold. At 11 sharp, the attendees arrived. Lady Honora, Bellamy, still sceptical, still stiff, though the tremor in her gloved hands betrayed nerves. Delphine Devereux, composed as ever, though her eyes flicked constantly toward the inkpot. Colonel Wexley, pale but intrigued, his military posture intact. Inspector Durant, standing silently by the door, arms folded. Beatrice Lee, freshly released, her presence a shadow of guilt and shame, but not of crime. And finally, though escorted under guard, Rupert, Halliwell, silent and surly. Poirot stood before them all, the firelight casting sharp lines across his face. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "we have arrived at the final page of this curious tale, a tale not of passion nor of greed, but of pride and fear." He glanced at each of them in turn. "You see, the death of Lord Charles Devlin was not an outburst, not a crime of heat. It was a quiet thing, a methodical thing, like ink poured drop by drop into a well until it overflows. Except, in this case, it was not ink, but intent." Rupert let out a low scoff. Poirot ignored it. He raised the ink pot. This object was meant to be a flourish, a prop for a poetry reading, but someone made it into a weapon. A silent, elegant weapon. Why? He turned to the room, because Devlin made enemies, not with action, but with implication. He traded in suggestion, in threat. He promised scandal, but never revealed the details, because suggestion is more powerful than exposure. A whisper controls more than a scream. Poirot crossed to the window, looking out into the spring fog. Devlin was assembling a manuscript, not just memoir, but manipulation, a catalogue of leverage, and it contained names, dates, scandals, including one that might have destroyed the literary career of Rupert Halliwell. He turned. Rupert was once an aspiring academic who turned to the arts after failing to secure his position at Cambridge. He borrowed liberally from Devlin's old essays, reframed them, and submitted them to publishers. Devlin discovered it, and in exchange for silence, demanded Rupert abandon any claim to the Veritans' literary legacy. Rupert said nothing, jaw clenched. Devlin's intention, Poirot continued, was to destroy Rupert socially, slowly, with innuendo, with the slow drip of doubt among peers. But Rupert moved first. Poirot stepped forward. He knew Beatrice was vulnerable, loyal to Delphine, easily rattled. So he planted a vial, conveniently seen, so she would panic, so she would believe she had somehow contributed to Devlin's death. Beatrice lowered her eyes. Poirot's voice softened. But it was not her mistake. It was his design. Rupert dosed the inkpot with cyanide, knowing Devlin would sign a note. His peculiar habit. A quick lick to the nib. Enough. Delphine's voice broke the silence. But why not just poison the drink? Because that would be expected, Poirot said, and easily traced. But poisoning the ink? Ingenious. A murder disguised as literary affectation. He turned to Rupert. And then, monsieur, you compounded the deception. You stole the manuscript, you burned pages, you tampered with records, and you encouraged Beatrice, who adored Miss Devereux, to take the blame. Rupert stood. I never told her to confess. No, Poirot said. You didn't need to. You built the illusion that she already had. Rupert hesitated, just long enough. Poirot stepped aside and gestured to Inspector Durant. I believe you now have enough to act, Inspector. Durant nodded. We'll be filing murder charges. Lady Honora gasped audibly. Delphine closed her eyes. Rupert, ever the actor, stood straighter. This will not stick. It's all circumstantial. Poirot smiled faintly. Perhaps, but as Devlin once wrote, the suggestion of guilt is often more damning than proof itself. Durant led Halliwell out in silence. After the room had emptied, Delphine remained behind. She approached Poirot quietly. "You saved Beatrice," she said. Poirot bowed slightly. "I gave her the truth. The salvation was her own." Delphine's voice was distant. "And what of me?" Poirot looked at her for a long moment. "You live with words, madame. Use them. Speak more gently. Let them heal." Delphine nodded once. "And the inkpot?" Poirot walked to the fireplace and picked it up. He held it to the light. "This," he said, "shall go into the archives, not as evidence, but as reminder." "A reminder of what?" Poirot's expression grew distant. "That the finest objects," he said, "can conceal the cruelest intentions, and that silence, when mixed with fear, is the most dangerous ink of all." He replaced it on the mantel, where the firelight flickered across its surface. Later, as he departed the Veriton Club for the final time, Poirot paused at the great brass doors and turned once more to the salon. The chairs had been reset, the fire had gone out, but in the air, faint as dust, still lingered the words unsaid, and Poirot, ever precise, ever listening, left them undisturbed, for some truths, he knew, were best read between the lines. Chapter 7. The Reveal. 2 days after Rupert Halliwell's arrest, the Veriton Club issued a statement so brief and so polished that one might assume nothing of note had happened there beyond a misplaced wine decanter. The death of Lord Charles Devlin was referred to as a tragic event. The investigation concluded, swiftly and satisfactorily, but in the library of Whitehaven Mansions, far from the pruned hedges and velvet chairs of Grosvenor Square, Hercule Poirot sat across from Inspector Durant, recounting the story behind the facade. Durant, pencil in hand, had just asked, "And what exactly convinced you that Halliwell was the true killer, not Beatrice?" Poirot steepled his fingers. "It was not a single fact, mon ami," he said, "but a pattern of behaviour, a series of inconsistencies that, when viewed together, formed a very precise design." He stood and walked to his cabinet, withdrawing a slim folder of notes. "Let us begin at the beginning, not with the death, but with the inkpot." Durant raised a brow. "Go on." Poirot laid out the folder, each page marked with red tabs. "You will recall that Delphine Devereux lent Lady Honora the silver inkpot to provide ambience for the poetry reading. Decorative, yes, but not innocent. Delphine said it had only dyed water, so she claimed, and yet the ink inside had been tampered with, mixed with a bitter agent, cyanide, traceable only in liquid form, and very fast-acting when absorbed." Durant nodded. "So, whoever tampered with the ink knew Devlin would handle it?" "Exactly. And more specifically," Poirot continued, "they knew Devlin's peculiar habit. He sealed every handwritten note by licking the quill tip and blotting it with parchment. A small flourish, an affectation, easily overlooked, except by someone." Watching closely, Durant leaned back. "You think Halliwell planned the whole thing based on that?" Poirot raised a finger. "Not merely planned, designed." He turned the next page in the file. Rupert Halliwell had much to gain. He was being blackmailed, subtly, yes, but effectively, by Devlin, who had discovered Halliwell's plagiarism of old essays. Devlin never published the accusation. He simply implied that he might, to publishers, to peers. His silence was a weapon, but so too was Rupert's pride. Poirot paced slowly when Rupert discovered that Delphine would be bringing the inkpot. He saw an opportunity. He secured a small quantity of liquid cyanide, an old connection, perhaps from his academic days, and added it to the ink in the pot after Delphine had delivered it to Honora's reading table. Durant frowned. And no one saw him? No, Poirot said, but that is where his true cunning emerged. He needed to create a distraction, a false suspect. So he approached Beatrice Lee. Through Delphine? Indirectly. He knew Beatrice adored Delphine. He played on her loyalty. He planted the vial, an empty one, in Lady Honora's handbag, deliberately in a way Beatrice could glimpse it. Enough to panic her. Precisely. He counted on Beatrice's guilt, her sense of fragility. And when Lord Devlin died, she blamed herself. She had no idea what had truly happened, but the suggestion of guilt was enough. Poirot lifted a photograph, a blurred snapshot of the letter Devlin had signed just before his death. Devlin's signature on the final note, written in his typical style, sealed with ink, was the key. No other contact with the poison existed. He drank no tea, ate no food, only that quill. Durant gave a low whistle. So Halliwell used Beatrice to take the fall. Oui, but that is not all. Poirot opened a new file, this one containing 3 pages torn from Devlin's unpublished memoir, retrieved from Halliwell's apartment. These pages, he said, contained the names of those Devlin claimed to have leverage over. And at the very top, Rupert Halliwell. Devlin called him the most polished fraud I've ever sponsored. A line Halliwell could not allow to be printed. Durant took a moment, reading the sentence aloud, and so he stole the manuscript. Poirot nodded. Yes, or rather, removed the damning pages and claimed the manuscript was unfinished. He intended to destroy them entirely, had he not been arrested first. Durant folded his hands. And Beatrice? Poirot's voice softened. She was manipulated. She was frightened. She never administered the poison. But her guilt and her fear of losing Delphine's regard made her believe she had somehow helped. He turned to the final page. There are many kinds of guilt, mon ami, but only one kind of truth. Later that afternoon, Poirot returned to the Veritan Club one final time. The winter salon had been cleared of its poetic trappings. The silver inkpot, now empty, sanitized and tarnished, sat behind glass in a display marked Curiosities of the Club. Delphine was waiting near the fire, her gloved hands folded. "You've solved it, then," she said, voice even. "Oui," Poirot replied, "though it was never just a murder. No, it was a contest," he said, "between silence and truth. Devlin lived by the former. Halliwell tried to preserve it. But Beatrice showed us the cost." Delphine's gaze flicked to the inkpot. "She'll be all right." "With time," Poirot said. "The law has no claim on her, but guilt leaves fingerprints of its own." Delphine stood. "I should have protected her better." Poirot smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but in the end She survived because she chose to speak. He turned to go. And remember, madam, he added, a poet may sharpen her words as a blade, but it is the quiet listener who decides where they land. That evening, Poirot sat in his study at Whitehaven Mansions, sipping his tisane. He opened his notebook to the final page and wrote, Case, the puzzle of the silver inkpot murderer, Rupert Halliwell. Weapon, ink laced with cyanide, administered. Via signature quill motive, reputation, pride, fear of exposure, fatal error, underestimating silence. He closed the notebook with a snap. Then he rose, straightened his cuffs, and gazed at the city lights glowing beyond the curtain. Murder, he murmured, is rarely loud, but it always leaves an echo, and in the silence that followed, Poirot smiled. For once again, the little grey cells had spoken clearly. Chapter 8. Outcome and Justice. A week had passed since Rupert Halliwell's arrest. The morning papers now bore less urgency about the Veriton ink murder, reducing it from shocking scandal to neatly archived mystery. Just another column tucked between Parliament squabbles and society weddings. The literary elite, eager to preserve their mystique, spun the affair into a dark tale of envy and artistic obsession. But to those involved, it remained something far more personal. Beatrice Lee had returned to her small flat in Chelsea. She had not resumed her position at the Veriton Club, nor had she spoken to Delphine Devereux since that final gathering. Poirot, however, had not forgotten her. That morning he arrived at her doorstep with a small bouquet of snowdrops. Delicate, quiet things that bloom even in cold soil. Beatrice opened the door with red-rimmed eyes and said nothing as he stepped inside. I thought, Poirot said gently, you might allow me a final conversation. She nodded and gestured to the worn chair by the window. I've been trying to read again, she whispered, but everything reminds me of him, of her. Poirot sat, setting the flowers down on the sill. And yet you were never the one to blame. Beatrice shook her head. But I believed I was. That's what he counted on. Rupert knew exactly how to make me doubt myself. Poirot leaned forward. He was not the first to use fear to control another, mademoiselle, but you must not let him be the last. Beatrice turned to him, her voice trembling. Was I foolish? No, Poirot said. You were trusting, and trust, though dangerous, is not a weakness. It is a kind of hope. He stood and adjusted his cuffs. I believe you will write again. Perhaps not now, but one day, and when you do, your words will not tremble. She looked up. Do you really believe that? Poirot smiled. It is my profession to believe in truth, even when it hides in the quietest corner. That afternoon, Poirot paid a final visit to Delphine Devereux, who had requested his presence at her private suite above the publishing house, where she was preparing a new anthology. She met him in a sun-drenched study, lined with books. On the central table, a single manuscript lay open beside a crystal paperweight shaped like a bell. Poirot raised an eyebrow. A new collection. Delphine gave a tight smile. A curated volume. Verse on guilt, silence, and justice. I thought, perhaps, I'd dedicate it to Charles Devlin, or to Beatrice. Poirot nodded. Or perhaps both. For one taught you fear, and the other redemption. She looked out the window. I still wonder what might have happened if I'd confronted Rupert myself. If I hadn't retreated behind Beatrice. Poirot said nothing for a moment. Guilt, he said softly, is not the same as culpability. You were used, madam, and so was she. Delphine turned back toward him. Do you think the truth is enough to undo damage? No, Poirot said honestly, but truth is the beginning. It allows us to mourn properly, to judge correctly, and sometimes to forgive. She gave a single nod. And Rupert? He will stand trial, Poirot replied. Scotland Yard has the manuscript pages, the ink analysis, and Beatrice's withdrawn confession. The Crown will seek a conviction. And if they fail? Poirot gave the faintest shrug. Then Monsieur Halliwell will live knowing that the world now sees, through him, and for a man so concerned with appearances, that may be punishment enough. At Whitehaven Mansions that evening, Poirot received a letter in a pale lavender envelope. The handwriting was small, round, and delicate. Monsieur Poirot, I have decided to leave London. I've taken a position at a library in Northumberland. Quiet, unglamorous work, but it feels right. I wanted to thank you again for seeing me clearly, and not as I seemed in the shadow of that salon. I may write again some day. If I do, I hope I will remember how to use words with courage, not fear. Yours in gratitude, Beatrice Lay. Poirot smiled as he folded the letter and placed it gently beside his case file. Courage, he murmured, is not always loud. Walk to the window, the London skyline glowing softly against the evening sky. The Veriton Club had already recovered. Lady Honora had resumed her readings, now featuring more of her own work than Shelley. Colonel Wexley, ever loyal to dignity, had donated Devlin's portrait to a lesser-known literary hall in the spirit of quiet legacy. The inkpot, however, had disappeared. Poirot had suggested it be melted down and reshaped, perhaps into a paperweight, something harmless, something new. But Wexley, ever the traditionalist, had instead locked it away in the club's private vault. A symbol of what we no longer speak of, he'd said. Poirot had not argued. Some things, after all, are better unwritten. As the clock struck 10, Poirot poured himself a final tisane and returned to his favourite chair. He opened his notebook, flipped to the final page of the case, and added a line beneath the others. Final observation. The deadliest ink is not spilled, it is swallowed. He capped his pen, set the book aside, and leaned back. Outside, the city murmured on, oblivious to the death of a man who once held secrets, like weapons. Inside, Poirot's flat glowed with order and peace. Chapter 9. Poirot's Final Reflection. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Hercule Poirot took a stroll through Green Park, his polished shoes tapping a steady rhythm on the gravel path. London was unusually hushed, birdsong more pronounced than traffic, leaves rustling louder than idle chatter. He preferred the city like this, when the world exhaled. He had not taken on another case since the conclusion of the Inkpot affair, as the press had dubbed it. He needed distance, not from the events themselves, but from their implications. This had not been a crime of passion, nor one of blood, but of suggestion, and the slow, insidious manipulation of one soul by another. And Poirot, more than ever, found himself reflecting on how delicately evil can wear the costume of intellect. Returning to Whitehaven Mansions later that afternoon, Poirot found his flat infused with spring light, soft and golden. The case file on Rupert Halliwell sat on the corner of his writing desk, unopened since the previous evening. He sat down slowly, the weight of the chair creaking slightly beneath him. He opened the file, not to study, but to conclude. He flipped to a blank page. At the top he wrote, "Case Summary, The Puzzle of the Silver Inkpot, London March, April, and beneath that, in precise strokes. Crime, the calculated murder of Lord Charles Devlin by Rupert Halliwell, using cyanide-laced ink in a ceremonial inkpot. Method, poisoning via ingestion during a poetry reading. The ink was placed knowing Devlin's habitual signature and ink-dipping gesture. Motive, protection of reputation, fear of literary exposure, ego masked as intellectual rivalry. Misdirection, Beatrice Lee's unwitting role as a pawn, manipulated by Halliwell to distract suspicion. Key clues, Devlin's final note, the missing manuscript pages, Beatrice's confession under psychological coercion, and Halliwell's theft from the archives. Poirot paused, his pen hovering. Then he added one final line. Final note, the murder was quiet, the guilt was loud, and justice, as always, arrived not with a bang, but with clarity. Later that evening, as twilight rolled across the Thames, Captain Hastings arrived at Whitehaven for supper, back from Argentina with tales of farming setbacks and a crate of overripe oranges. "You look tired, Poirot," Hastings said as they sat down with modest bowls of soup. "This case, was it particularly taxing?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "It was not taxing to solve, mon ami, but it was difficult to accept." He frowned. "Why? You solved it with your usual brilliance." "Ah, but it is not brilliance that troubles me," Poirot replied. "It is how little violence was required. Halliwell did not raise a hand. He merely planted a thought. And that was enough to kill." Poirot nodded solemnly. "A thought wrapped in literary ambition. That, mon ami, is what disturbed me most." Hastings stirred his soup. "But surely we've seen worse villains." "Worse, yes, but few so elegant." Poirot stood and walked to the fireplace, where the now sterilized inkpot sat beneath a glass dome, returned to him by Wexley with the cryptic comment, "Perhaps you'll know what to do with it." "I have always admired words," Poirot said softly. "They are the tools of truth. And yet, in this case, they were used to create illusions." Hastings nodded slowly. "Like Devlin's threats. He never said anything directly, did he?" "No, but his suggestion of secrets controlled those around him. And Halliwell, he mastered that same art. He understood how to speak just enough, and when not to speak at all." Poirot turned, "But silence, Hastings, is not always passive. Sometimes it is a weapon." Before bedtime, Poirot prepared a fresh tisane, opened his balcony doors to let in the breeze, and sat at his desk once more. He took out a fresh sheet of monogrammed stationery. He began writing not a report, nor a letter to the police, but a note to himself, one he would file away privately. Reflection, the silver inkpot case. The mind, when fearful, becomes pliable. The tongue, when cautious, becomes imprecise, and in such a state the truth may be guided not by facts, but by the shadows cast around them. He paused, then added, "The cleverest killers use neither knives nor guns. They use assumptions. In this case, a quill. It is not what people say that damns them, but what they allow others to believe." He signed the page simply. HPA knock came at the door just as he was preparing for bed. The concierge handed him a small parcel. No return address, only a single embossed seal, a gold inkpot. Inside, Poirot found a bound chapbook, slim and pale blue, titled Inkblot Verses, a reflection on silence below it, in faint italic. By Beatrice Le Poirot, opened to the first page. It read, "For the man who taught me that silence is not a virtue when it protects the wicked, and that truth is not weakness when it comes gently." He closed the cover and held it for a moment. Then, placing it beside the inkpot, he turned off the lamp. Outside the wind stirred, and within Poirot allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, to sleep deeply, not because the case was over, but because the story had been told. Chapter 10. Curtain Call. The trial of Rupert Halliwell lasted exactly 12 days. By the 4th, the public's curiosity had cooled. By the 7th, the tabloids turned their attention to a scandal involving a viscount's missing poodle and an heiress's motorcar accident in Mayfair. By the 12th, the jury returned with its verdict. Guilty. Halliwell stood stone-faced as the sentence was read. Life imprisonment, with eligibility for parole in 20 years. He did not speak, nor did he look back at the spectators gathered in the gallery. Beatrice Lee was not in court that day, nor was Delphine Devereux. Only Poirot remained to watch the final gavel fall. As always, he waited not for spectacle, but for truth. And now that the courtroom was empty and the reporters gone, he knew the final chapter was ready to be written. 1 week later, on a rain-misted morning in late April, Poirot received an envelope bearing a familiar crest. The Vereton Club. Inside was a note from Colonel Wexley, handwritten and composed with soldierly brevity. Monsieur Poirot, on behalf of the board, I wish to express gratitude for your discretion and clarity. While the events that unfolded within our walls were regrettable, we believe they have reminded us of a fundamental truth. Reputation is not legacy. We shall be donating the inkpot, as you suggested, to the British Museum's Crimes of Curiosity exhibit. You will find enclosed a token of our appreciation. Yours with respect, Colour. Edward Wexley folded inside was a silver quill tippin, inset with a sapphire droplet where the nib met the shaft. Poirot smiled, an elegant gesture for an inelegant crime. He placed the pin on his desk and turned toward the window. Below, the streets shimmered with morning rain, the kind that turned London silver and quieted even the most stubborn footfalls. It was time for one final visit. The café on the north edge of Hampstead Heath was not fashionable, just comfortable. A fire burned in the grate. The tea came in mismatched cups, and seated at the farthest table, her fingers ink-smudged and wrapped around a warm mug, sat Beatrice Lay. Poirot approached, his hat held respectfully in both hands. She looked up. and smiled. "I thought you might come. I never like to leave a page unfinished, mademoiselle." He took the seat across from her. "You've read it?" she asked. Poirot nodded. "Every verse, twice." "And?" "It is clear, simple, and truthful, which, I believe, makes it dangerous to those who thrive on ambiguity." She blushed softly. "I nearly didn't send it, but Delphine insisted. She is wiser than she pretends." Beatrice looked out the window. "You know, I've stopped blaming myself." Poirot tilted his head. "Ah, that is good." "I realized something. What Halliwell did wasn't just manipulation. It was design. He created an illusion so precise that I mistook it for reality. That isn't my fault. It's his crime." Poirot leaned back, pleased. "You see clearly now." She paused. "And you? Do you feel at peace with how it ended?" He smiled faintly. "I do. Because the truth, as I always say, must not merely be uncovered. It must be understood." She nodded. "And what will you do now?" "Ah," Poirot said, finishing the last sip of his tisane, "I shall return to my routine. A little gardening, a few puzzles, perhaps a new case, if the world insists." She reached into her bag and handed him a small envelope. "I thought you might like this." Inside was a single page torn from a day. Notebook. At the top, in flowing script, "For Hercule Poirot, a man who listens not to the noise of voices, but the silence between them." He folded the paper with care and stood. "Mademoiselle," he said, "you will do great things with your silence and with your pen." She smiled, and as Poirot left the café, the clouds broke over Hampstead, and the light that followed was silver, just like ink in the right hands.